Thanks for your patience. Just setting up that YouTube stream. So you should be able to go to our YouTube as well. Great, so I'm gonna share my screen really quick, and then we'll get to the presentations that our guests have for today. So tonight I am very excited for another China is Not Our Enemy webinar here at CODEPINK Women for Peace. We're going to be hearing from Indigenous CHamoru scholars, lawyers, and activists themselves about the lived impact of the US's militarization, in particular recent escalated militarization, the impact on Indigenous peoples and their land, air, seas, climate, safety and sovereignty in Guåhan, which is Guam, as well as the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas. In the escalating US hybrid war on China, the US is ramping up militarization of its colonies in the Asia Pacific, such as Okinawa, Hawaii, and in Guåhan alone, the US military is currently razing ancient carbon sequestering forests, murdering tens of thousands at a time of endangered whales, poisoning local drinking water, aquifers, building over ancestral burial grounds, endangering people with military exercises, and much more. And this is all with the stated goal within our Pentagon budget in the US of joint force lethality in, quote, countering the falsely inflated threat of China. And we know that there's much false inflation here because of how aggressive the US military is, the forward deployment. So we hear a lot about Indigenous ethnic minorities in plenty of other sovereign nations, but it is crucial that we center Indigenous Pacific Islanders whose safety, sovereignty, dignity, land, and water is being actively endangered by our US military, by our US tax dollars. Guam or Guåhan is a US military colony, and this ongoing oppression and exacerbation of the climate crisis is funded by our US tax dollars. And it is strategically erased from public discourse in the mainstream media in the US. So this is what we can impact as US citizens in the belly of the empire. This is where we should focus our time and our attention. So we're going to hear about ways that we can do that today. And I just want to, so this is a little bit about our campaign. You can follow us on Twitter and you can check out our campaign site, and you can also contact me as we counter US-led aggression towards China. And I really want to thank our awesome co-sponsors for supporting this event tonight. Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. And we'll put some links in the chat so you can check out these organizations and their work. Pivot to Peace, Peace Action Maine, Veterans for Peace Climate Crisis and Militarism Project. Definitely check out, they have great resources about the intersections of climate and militarism. Pacific Asian Nuclear Free Peace Alliance. Just Transition Hawaii Coalition, World Beyond War, Women for Genuine Security, Military Poisons, part of WELP, and No Cold War, the Britain section of the international campaign. Thanks again to all of these partners. And I want to highlight, we'll be putting in the chat pretty soon, and again at the end of the webinar, we're trying to get signatures to deliver our letter on the EAGLE Act, HR 3524, which is going to a vote in the House fairly soon, which includes $7.5 billion for the Department of Defense for militarism in the Asia Pacific, at least $225 million for direct military training in the Asia Pacific, as well as money for propaganda for Radio Free Asia. And generally, it's going to exacerbate our climate crisis. So please check out codepink.org/EagleAct to sign this. And we're going to be delivering it to Congress within the next week or so. We're just trying to narrow down the best targets, and we'll be delivering to all of the House foreign staffers as well, foreign affairs staffers. Great, so I'm going to stop sharing and get to our webinar tonight. Oh, I forgot, I'm actually going to show one more thing first. I'm going to show a video, and then I'll introduce our first speaker, Dr. Kuper. Sorry about that. So I'm going to share two little sections of this. So I'm going to pause it. And this is just to give some context. So actually, this is from the Navy. It's an informational video by the Navy on the testing area in the Mariana Islands. So you can see their perspective and what we're dealing with.
The Mariana Islands are irreplaceable. The air, land, and sea areas are important to all people of the Marianas, including members of the United States military who call the islands home. For decades, the Mariana Islands have provided a safe training and testing environment for the military. The islands are an ideal setting because of their location in the Indo-Asia Pacific region, allowing the military to maintain a global and strategic presence. In 1944, the United States liberated the Mariana Islands from Japanese occupation. Since then, the military's presence in the Western Pacific has been vital to supporting World War II, the Korean conflict, the Vietnam War, Desert Storm, and operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. The islands and its people have also supported humanitarian missions and provided relief and shelter for refugees and migrants. Military training and testing activities take place primarily in established military air, land, and sea areas, collectively called the Mariana Islands Range Complex. Here, personnel from the United States Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard train as realistically as possible, so they are prepared when called upon. Every day, the military ensures the United States, its territories, and the environment are protected and safe. Military personnel need to train as realistically as possible to maintain readiness. New technologies also must be researched, developed, tested, and evaluated to ensure they are thoroughly tested and
I'm just going to skip ahead. Skip past this guy, ideally.
Driving around in a tube in the dark.
Much remains to be learned about our ocean environment, including how sonar affects marine species. To minimize impacts, the Navy works closely with the National Marine Fisheries Service, and while training and testing at sea, the Navy implements a number of mitigation measures. Some measures include monitoring for marine mammals and sea turtles before and during training exercises and testing activities, and reducing or stopping sonar use if the animals are sighted within certain distances.
If there's any way of minimizing sound, we will do it. We do take precautions looking at where each ship is going, and we also look at each biologic they're transiting through. If we can predict where they're going to be, then we will maneuver through there without affecting them.
The Navy is a world leader in marine species research and has funded and partnered with universities, institutions, and researchers to study marine species physiology and behavior and share information to better understand the ocean environment. This work helps environmental regulators, the scientific community, and the Navy better predict the potential effects our activities may have. It also contributes to the scientific community's improved knowledge of marine life and habitats. In the Mariana Islands, the Navy conducted marine mammal surveys and recorded more than 377 cetacean groups, including multiple species of dolphins and whales.
Well, we're putting forth the effort to make a better Navy. Compared to back then, things are changing. There are more regulations, restrictions, but it's shaping up for the better. It's a lot cleaner Navy. As far as the environment goes, we are putting money into research.
The Navy strives to minimize impacts on coral reefs by conducting pre-landing surveys prior to amphibious operations and participating in the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force. Onshore, the military has programs to protect threatened and endangered species, control invasive species, and protect cultural and historical resources, including ancient CHamoru, Spanish era, and World War II sites. The military is committed to protecting the island's natural and cultural resources and heritage and strives to minimize the effects of its training and testing activities on the environment. Testing and training are crucial. What we do here makes the United States, its territories, and the world safer.
So you can get some visuals from there to know the type of geography and part of the ocean we're talking about right now, and all of the wars that have basically had a triangulation around Guåhan. And at the end, you can see some greenwashing, some justifying of climate devastation that the US military causes for our planet by talking about funding research and the benefit that the military has to marine life, which is very much overshadowed by the impact of our military on our climate crisis. So let me introduce our first speaker, and our speakers might be referencing that video for context later on. Our first speaker is Dr. Kenneth Gofigan Kuper, who is an assistant professor of political science, specializing in security studies and international relations and CHamoru Studies at the University of Guam. He holds a Ph.D. in political science and an MA in Pacific Island Studies from the University of Hawaiʻi at Mānoa. His dissertation focused on the complexities of military presence and security in Guam through the concept of sustainable insecurity. His research interests include the role of islands in global politics, Indo-Pacific geopolitics, militarization of the Pacific Islands, decolonization, and the reconceptualization of security. Thank you so much, Dr. Kuper. And I'm gonna allow you to share your screen really quickly. One moment.
All right, so Juice Mossy, I'm glad to be here. So while I get this set up, hope everyone's doing well, no matter where you're at, yeah? Morning, night, afternoon, I hope we're all doing okay. Trying to lift the mood after that video, and because my presentation is gonna bring the mood back down, so let's have a temporary uplifting of mood. Okay, so I'll go ahead and share here. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about Guam primarily, and we'll go into why there's a sort of a split. But I'm talking about the anatomy of the spear's tip, right? And so I think I should begin by saying that I was at a lavender farm in Maui when my mother called me crying. It was April of 2013. So between exasperated cries, my mom yelped and pleaded, and she said, "Son, please pray for us." And at the time when I was in Maui, I had no idea what was going on. And she said, "They're going to bomb us. North Korea is going to bomb us." And she was referring to a threat made by North Korea, saying that their missiles could reach the waters surrounding the military bases in the American territory of Guam. So 2013, and this really got me thinking, and this led me to wonder why Guam. So my presentation today is really focusing on giving a context of why Guam. We hear Guam in these particular contexts of war or potential threats, so why us, okay? And in reference to that video, just real quickly, I know the other speakers will get into this a lot more than I will, but here in Guam, we tend to live in a permanent state of mitigation, right? Where it's always finding this mitigation framework that obviously puts a lot of our interests as secondary. So first, to situate Guam, the island, which is a mere 212 square miles, hosts large American military bases. There's Anderson Air Force, which occupies the northern tip of the island, and Naval Base Guam, which is primarily in the south. There are also scattered installations, okay? But we also see the continuing development of Marine Corps Base Camp Laws. The military currently occupies around 27% of the island, and the strategic importance of Guåhan has led to our nicknames such as the Tip of the Spear, Fortress Guam, and America's unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Pacific. So why Guam? Robert Rogers in Destiny's Landfall wrote that Guam, in short, was destined after Magellan to be a pawn in the realpolitik of foreign powers. And I still think that in many ways we are viewed in this way, right? So what about us? Well, we're closer by 14 hours flight time and 5 to 7 days sea transit time to East Asia than is any other US-based facility. We offer the regions in the Marianas in total, offers the region's live fire bombing range. We have an excellent deep water port with significant room for wharf expansion. We have facilities for the US Air Force. We have large aviation fuel storage depots, and we have a large Pacific weaponry storage, as well as a naval magazine capable of holding considerable conventional nuclear munitions, right? So this is why Guam is such a key piece, and we will see later in the presentation in the continuing sort of escalations here in the region. Now, we also constitute what is called the center of the second island chain. So for those of you who know about the island chain strategy, Guam constitutes the second. The first island chain is really, regarding primarily like Taiwan, and then Guam is the center. Okay, so Guam will help provide logistical support to the first island chain. A lot of this stems from this man, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who believed in his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, that America getting a blue water navy would be a great sort of boon for the country's expansion and power projection. And in one of his letters, he wrote this: "No situation in our possession equals Guam for protecting every security interest in the Pacific," right? Because by basis of operations allow the US to protect commerce during peacetime and of course be strategically located during wartime. And so we can see that as early on as the early 1900s, obviously when we were acquired by the United States, this sort of strategic thinking about the island is not new, right? It goes back all the way to Mahan, okay? So what I like to call it is the imperial magic trick, because if you look at depictions of islands in general, we're either or. We're important, right, strategically, but we're also disposable. We are simultaneously both. We are places of exploitation, and we're also places of nothingness, right? And this is encapsulated in this report when they were talking about the acquisition of islands, where the Navy admirals, one of them said, none of the islands in question possess natural features or values other than the military standpoint. And thus, acquiring these islands should not constitute territorial aggrandizement because they don't have any economic value. So that's the imperial magic trick. Are we unimportant and useless, or are we extremely important? And I think it's both at the same time in different perspectives, and it allows a discursive justification for the acquisition of islands in a way that doesn't cause political headaches in larger geographical land masses. So if we look at the annual report of the governor, 1905, to look more closely at Guam, we see here the location of Guam in the center of the Western Pacific make it of great and recognized strategic value to the US, and it has neither present nor prospective economic value, and should not then excite the interest of other than scientific and military men. So we see this thought, right? We're going from 1890s and we're going to end up in 2021. So I call this, when we look at the situation in Guam, the macabre waltz, right? A dark room with two ghouls dancing together to truly bring life to the macabre waltz of Guam's complex situation today. When you take off the mask of the ghouls, you see the manipulation of our geographical location, holding arms with our lack of sovereignty as an unincorporated territory, which is our current political status. I believe that our current political status is a ground by which the United States can gamble with Guam for the pursuit of their national interests in what they newly deem the Indo-Pacific region. And thus it is in US interest for Guam to remain a colony. Whether it is the geopolitical game played over Chinese development in the South China Sea, or the escalating crisis in either the Korean Peninsula or heating up with China in the way that they describe it, the vulnerability and strategic significance of Guam is often reduced, where we become a rung on the escalation ladder, then a national territory to be protected. And I think that's a huge difference. So let's look at these two ghouls dancing together in this macabre waltz. The first is our endurance, geographical endurance. This is Vice Admiral Jonathan Greenert. who wrote, "Guam is a hub. Guam has geography, and that will be enduring. It is now becoming very important to us again. Guam will always be strategically important because of its geography alone. So goal one, geography, strategic manipulation of our geographical location. Two, unincorporated territory. When Chamorros were pushing for citizenship, the Navy actually testified against it. And one thing they said in their testimony against giving Chamorro citizenship and civilian government was the geographical location of Guam in the midst of foreign territory, with foreign commercial and colonizing interests to be considered, together with the racial problems of that locality, combined to provide a fertile field for international disputes. So that was the Navy's testimony opposing this Chamorro push for civilian government. So I hate to be the bearer of bad quotes, but that seems what I'm trying to do today, to set up the context of bringing all these quotes here, right? But here we can see it. We can see it clearly, this macabre waltz that I call it. Geography, unincorporated territory, holding hands together to create the most fertile field for control of Guam, right? We're American territory, which reduces the political difficulty, right, of building and operating assets there, what Sasha Davis likes to call operational unilateralism. You don't need to ask permission. There is no Mother May I in Guam, right? And that's a problem. Furthermore, as they say, Guam with its pro-military population and 7.7% unemployment is unlikely to offer local opposition, okay? And then lastly, I want to bring you to this last line here. We can do what we want here and make huge investments without fear of being thrown out, right? So thus the macabre waltz, our geography and unincorporated territory works well, very close together. Now, the logic of retention, as we see, because I'm going to go into the more recent developments, okay? That video actually did provide some context into how we were used further on in the 1900s, but Guam was initially used as a coaling station, right? But technical obsolescence, even if we don't use coal, does not equal political obsolescence. And I think this is the logic of retention for islands such as Guam. Even if some outdated technology is no longer in the military's best interest, that doesn't equate to letting go of their territories, because Guam, in their mind, will probably remain strategically important, especially in the current geopolitical environment that they are discussing. Thus, unfortunately, all Indo-Pacific geopolitical roads tend to lead to Guam, and the geopolitical tectonic plates that shift in the region create various forms of earthquakes for the island. And I think that's very scary for the people of Guam, and it's something that we, the people of Guam and the CNMI, need to pay close attention to these developments in the region, no matter what, okay? So here are some things that are currently occurring, just to bring you to the present with my remaining time, okay? The Aegis Ashore deliberations, pretty much this top priority in the Indo-Pacific Command to create a 360-degree integrated air and missile defense system in the island. Okay, this is Admiral Philip Davidson, who before he retired, pretty much said it is the key piece of an Indo-PACOM strategy for the containment of China, right? And he said, when you look at the way the threat capability, threat capacity is manifesting from China in the future, whether it's ballistic missiles from the land or whether it's cruise missiles from air and maritime platforms, you're going to need a complete clock, a 360-degree coverage in order to help defend Guam. In the 2022 NDA passed by the House recently, this was also included, but it was pending a report on what would be the best air and missile defense system that's integrated, okay? So we can see this, right? Guam has not lost political obsolescence from Mayhan till now, right? There's also Malabar that just happened, interesting, where the military is what they're calling the Quad, US, Japan, India, Australia, had their exercises in August 2021, so just last month. It was high-tempo naval exercises, which was supposed to create what they call a testimony of synergy among the 4 Quad countries. Furthermore, there was Forager 21, which was really a theater army, First Corps ability to deploy land power forces. But what I think is important is that Operation Forager 21, what many of us may not know is that Operation Forager was the name of the operation to retake Guam from the Japanese. So now, from Operation Forager during World War II, what is the symbolism between Operation Forager in the 1940s during World War II and Operation Forager 21, right? So there's some symbolism there. In addition to this, there's a lot of continued money, right? Just this past week, we had a $122 million contract for Marine Corps firing range that was awarded. And our own representative or delegate in Congress called the recent military exercises in Guam the few real opportunities this year to help Guam's economy. So this is very complex, yeah? So I want to end with two things. My presentation today, what it really tried to do is just track the history of geopolitical thought in Guam. What the other presenters will do is really, I think, talk about what Dr. Robert Underwood said. The military is a 12-foot giant in our house. He's bound to step on some of your children. And in many ways, we see this on an everyday level. So here's what I want to leave you with. One warm Guåhan weekend, my daughter Inina and I were playing outside in my backyard. It was around 5 p.m. and it was a beautiful day with the wind blowing and the hot sun preparing for its rest. Then as I pushed my daughter on the swing we bought her, a loud noise came overhead and we saw a large black plane breaking the sound barrier and flying above us. My daughter immediately got scared and wanted me to carry her. Seeping past the piercing decibels of military planes taking off with the weight of munitions lies the CHamoru voice waiting to be heard. Beneath the curse of our lack of sovereignty and the manipulation of our geography, true genuine security for the CHamoru people is waiting. Truly, we in Guåhan deserve a cartography in which we take the cartographic pens away from the Pentagon and map our own policies and paths. My daughter deserves a future where she can hear is the sweet wind blowing in her face as she swings in her childhood backyard. So to that end, we cannot stop fighting for our right to self-determination, even in the face of the increasing strategic importance of the island in American strategic thought. To do any less feels too much like giving in to the self-fulfilling prophecy that we are just destiny's landfall. And let's not forget that the tip of the spear is always the bloodiest. Thank you. So before we transition to the next presentation, I will say that my presentation mainly focused about Guam, but Guam and the CNMI, due to political separation after the Spanish-American War, constitute two separate governments under the United States. So Guam is an unincorporated territory, and then we have the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. So that's just a little bit of why my concentration focused on Guam, acknowledging that there are two different governments and histories. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kuper. Thank you so much for summarizing so much of your research and reading through those very infuriating and nauseating colonialist, imperialist quotes, and for sharing that image of your beautiful daughter. And we're gonna move to, like Dr. Kuper said, speaker who's gonna talk more about the Northern Mariana Islands, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, Dr. Teresa or Isa Arreola, who is currently an assistant professor of critical Indigenous studies in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Concordia University. She is also the chair of Our Commonwealth 670 Saipan, a community advocacy group dedicated to research, awareness, education about militarization and its link to Indigenous self-determination. Isa's research focuses on the intersections of militarism, indigeneity, and the environment among Indigenous CHamoru and Refaluash peoples in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, where she was born and raised. Thank you so much, Dr. Arreola.
Thank you, Madison, and thank you, Dr. Kuper, for that awesome presentation. And I'm really going to be talking a little bit about my own work and the way it intersects with my personal life growing up on Saipan. And that video really gave a lot of good context for what I'll be talking about. But just to kind of clarify really quickly, I'm coming from the CNMI side, born and raised on Saipan. So that kind of changes the perspective just slightly. But to give some background, in the mid-1970s, the CNMI negotiated a covenant agreement that many of you are probably aware about, but it put us in a political union with the United States. And the kind of colloquial understanding of this relationship is that we could maintain self-governance, maintain ownership over our lands as those of Northern Marianas descent, because there was from the beginning an acknowledgement that land was scarce and it held deep cultural significance to our people. So when we returned, we received US citizenship, but we also agreed to kind of giving up, and I don't use that term lightly, but giving up a portion of our lands for national defense purposes. And this includes the island of Farallon Mendoneza, which is used for live fire training and bombing currently right now. It's only about 45 nautical miles away from Saipan. Portions of the island of Tinian next to Saipan, about 10 minutes from Saipan, and a small lease area on the actual island of Saipan. So I kind of look at the CNMI in this overall broader discussion as the contingency islands, right? We're always kind of talked about as the backup, and yet we comprise a really integral, portion of this overall buildup. But I think that history is important because, we maintain two separate governments. So we negotiate separately for land use, et cetera, with the US military. And the kind of problem up front that this creates is this false sense of segmentation in military planning, which is something we see all the time, especially with the DoD's release of its multiple environmental impact statements. And this is something that's been critiqued now for years by community members, both on Saipan and Guåhan, that you can't break up military planning into these multiple projects without assessing their overall, cumulative impacts throughout the entire archipelago, including the water and the air, right? We're not just talking about land. And so it's also interesting because there's this weird paradox here where, while the military presents all of these different segmented projects seemingly disconnected, they simultaneously characterize the Marianas as this homogeneous strategic location, as Dr. Kuper was mentioning, right, for its training and testing. Because in the words of the DoD, it's a quote, US territory. It provides urban training environments, expansive airspace, expansive surface and subsurface sea space. And the military is able to use live ordnance in authorized training spaces, right? So there's a couple of things I'll just kind of point out in the context of what the military calls this Mariana Islands training and testing study area, which is about the size of India. It's just under 1 million square nautical miles. So that gives you a sense of how large it is. And one of the things that's always kind of struck me living on Saipan and has been an important part of my own research is this notion of realism or realistic environments. So you'll see them talk about the Marianas as realistic environments a lot, the Navy, as the Navy calls it. And it's the formulation of the islands as these realistic training spaces that simultaneously kind of stamp out the liveness of the area of what is alive, about the place, about the people, and the non-human environment that spans the lands and the sea throughout the region. And so, sometimes, and you might see in a training video like the one we watched, the mention of Indigenous people, but we're usually talked about as being important insofar as we're seen as sharing the space. They often say that we share the space with the military, or in the context of cultural heritage, for example, like artifacts. The second thing that I want to kind of bring up is the notion of readiness, and I'm sure we'll be able to discuss this more during, if we have some time for Q&A, but and even the overarching kind of theme of buildup that began during the Obama administration as part of the Pacific pivot. But over the years, the question really in the CNMI and my community has become like, what are we readying ourselves for? What are we building up to? Where is all of this going? From the perspective of the Marianas, there often seems really to be no end in sight when it comes to readiness, because this perceived conflict with China and other adversaries like North Korea, as Dr. Kuper also mentioned, we all have our kind of stories about North Korea, the stories that we hear when they say that they're going to bomb. It provides this fuel for endless militarization in the region. And so, does the military need to prepare? They can prepare, yeah, sure. But how do we fit into that kind of broader picture of readiness as a society that continues to bear the brunt of the social and economic costs of this preparation, with little knowledge of really what's happening, especially from the perspective of those living in the continental US. And then lastly, another really important intersection, and I think experience with militarism in terms of its planetary scale, is of course the way it merges with climate change in the Marianas. And we're all, especially in a forum like this, we're all pretty much aware that we simply can't talk about climate change without talking about militarization, in part because we know the DoD is one of the biggest polluters on planet Earth, right? But also from the perspective of the CNMI, it's that militarism is really coinciding with a lot of devastating natural disasters that our community has been dealing with over the last 5 years, and so in particular 2 super typhoons, including Typhoon Yutu, which had which was a record-breaking typhoon that we're quite literally still recovering from on the islands. But the concern in this regard is the increasing strength of these super typhoons due to climate change and the further dependence that this entrenches between us and the military for aid, for example. And it really continues to put us in this vulnerable position and strips us of further political bargaining power for relying so heavily on this aid and funding to get out of these disasters. And one of the points of this kind of analysis is really to underscore the fact that climate change is viewed by the military as what's called a threat multiplier. So the idea that climate change exacerbates other security problems like food scarcity, water scarcity, for example, but it doesn't acknowledge its role in producing that actual problem. And instead, one of the tactics, at least in our community, that's so often employed when the Navy comes out is that it shifts the attention onto the scientific research that's being done, right? And all of the technologies that it employs in the MIT study area. So there's this idea that the MIT serves as this training and testing site, plus this bonus because it's also a study area for marine mammal research, for example, as you saw in the video. And so, for example, the Navy's tagline is defending freedom, protecting the environment. So just to close before I talk, to close before I talk just briefly about some of the kind of activism and work that's happening in the CNMI by the group that I'm really humbled to chair and represent, which is our Commonwealth 670, as Madison mentioned. I just want to share that, from the Marianas, readiness, it can't simply come at the expense of Indigenous livelihoods, as it's always been, right? We're constantly being forced to choose between national security and the preservation and of our own people and our own ways of life, and that's not a choice, right? Readiness is defined by the DoD as the ability of individual units in the armed forces to execute their assigned missions promptly and competently. But this shouldn't be, include using Oceania as the sacrificial lamb to be offered at the whims of the military-industrial complex. The rhetoric on island and daily conversations often leans to one kind of angle when you talk about China, and that really is fear, right? If the US leaves, what will happen? China will come in and completely overtake us. People say this sometimes, right? And then we'll really be in trouble. And that says a lot about the way that the media constructs China as this impending threat, and so much about the way that we're taught to understand what China is doing in the region. And of course, this distracts us from seeing the immediacy of what's happening, like right in front of our faces with the destruction of our islands that's happening right now, all of the different training. And so some of the work, Madison, am I okay with time?
Yes, you have up to 3 minutes.
Okay, great.
Remaining.
So I just want to close by talking about the advocacy work of our Commonwealth, which is a group of, it's an Indigenous and women-led group in the CNMI that's situated on Saipan, and we really try to build on a lot of the great work that other advocates that have come before us in our own communities and abroad, to really try to speak up and talk about these consequences, because it's still really hard, to talk about these issues in our own communities, right? So really trying to push solidarity across Oceania, right? In Okinawa, in Hawaii, working with CHamoru's in the diaspora, legislators in Guåhan, and trying to team up with other more national organizations like OBRAC, Overseas Base Realignment and Closure Coalition, and World Beyond War, to really get the word out that our islands aren't dispensable in this buildup, and that we really have a say as the rightful owners of this place, right? One of the things that I'm really I think Madison might have put we have a petition going around as well that's based off of President Biden's recent executive orders, but the group has also tried to introduce resolutions in the CNMI government. One of them was introduced by a representative, Sheila Bauta, and it really tried to, it aimed to protect the CNMI from any further harmful military activities. There was some pushback, but we also received a lot of community support, and many in the CNMI actually came out to testify about the fear of continuing these military plans with seemingly no end in sight, or little oversight over the irreparable damage to our cultural and natural resources. And the group is also working with Asia Pacific Forum on Women Law and Development to train women in our community to connect militarism to self-determination. Again, all of these really important conversations that are happening. There's a large resistance movement, and I'm very happy to be a part of that alongside these other panelists here. And with that, I'll just close, and hopefully we can open some conversation up in the Q&A. So thank you so much, Sizuos Maasi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ariola. Thank you for bringing in more perspective from the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and for sharing that video that I shared at the beginning. That was Isa's idea to give some context with that Navy propaganda video. So please check out the petition we put in the chat to ask Biden to honor his executive orders, commitments to environmental and racial justice. And I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Monica Nake Flores. She or they pronouns, a queer CHamoru artist and activist. Nake is a member of dynamic community orgs that focus on CHamoru self-determination, environmental justice, and the protection of sacred sites. Putehi Litakyan, I'm sorry if that's not the best pronunciation, and Save Ritidian, Hagan Famalau, Guåhan, and Independent Guåhan, all of which are part of the Fanode coalition that Nake is a part of. Thank you so much for all of the work that you do in this resistance work, Nake. And I'm going to give you privileges very quickly to share your screen with the audience and to share more about the work you do and your community.
All right. Sanamasi, Madison, half a day, everyone. Managaf Pupuhi for those of you where it's nighttime, and Mega Masi again. And thank you, Madison and CODEPINK and all the sponsors and organizers for today's event. And also a special thank you to the Honorable Representative Babauta, who is joining us. Thank you so much for being here. And I just also want to thank the previous speakers, Ken and Isa. And just like Ken said, I don't have anything fun to share. That's actually Julian's job. That's what Julian's here for, to sweep us away and inspire us. So for now, I'm going to contribute more devastating information. And it's just really exciting to see a lot of friends from all over, a lot of allies, and CHamoru's in the diaspora who are here with us. So it's great to see all of you. Thank you for being here. So I'm humbled to join this panel and stand in solidarity with all of you for peace and for genuine security in all of our homelands. And my name is Nake Flores, and I'm speaking to you from Guåhan in the Marianas homelands, or Lagos Zangani, the homelands of the CHamoru people. I'm a core member of Flotilla Texan Sayuritidian, a direct action group and community organization dedicated to the protection of natural resources, culturally significant resources, and sacred sites in Guåhan, specifically those located in sites identified for U.S. military live fire training. We oppose the establishment of any military firing range and stand in solidarity with groups in the Northern Marianas and the larger Pacific region for the prevention of further environmental degradation and desecration on sacred lands. And we support the return of ancestral lands to Native peoples. I'm also a member of Ihagen Famalawan Guåhan, which is an Indigenous CHamoru women's and gender diverse organization. And so these groups, are fairly new in the story of the CHamoru resistance movement. And so it's very important that I note that we are here today doing the work we're doing because of the strength and love of our ancestors. And of course, because of the work that precedes us and the mentorship of many elders, a lot of whom are Native women. And I have to mention some of them: Auntie Hope Cristobal, Dr. Lisa Linda Natividad, Mama Jill Kitcho Beneventi, Auntie Debbie Kanata, and of course, may as well say Cinta Kaipat from the NMI. And I want to say a special acknowledgement for Auntie Kat McCullum, who is a direct descendant of the families at Letexan who lost their land because of military occupation in the federal government, taking their land, forcing them to leave by eminent domain. And she recently lost her husband. And so I just want to say that we hold Auntie Kat in our hearts, and all of these elders continue to inform and inspire the work that we do. So, I'm going to be going back and forth between sharing slides and talking. And I just wanted to start off by sort of giving a little bit more context, since we started off with propaganda and Ken's presentation, so I know a lot of you already know a lot about Guam and our political status, that we're an unincorporated territory. That means that we have US passports. We cannot vote for president. We have limited participation in Congress, a delegate that doesn't have a true vote. We have exclusions on certain programs such as unemployment and Social Security disability insurance. We have very limited federal funding, and we have many restrictive federal territorial policies that inhibit our economic sovereignty, such as the Jones Act. And of course, in terms of the military expansion, we often don't have, a very powerful or strategic role in that planning. And so I'm going to go ahead and just share a map also, since Ken was talking about strategic location, just to give you a sense of really Guam's proximity to, where we are in the Pacific, and how that geography is constantly used to objectify us and justify the environmental racism and violence that continues to take place here and in the Marianas and throughout the Pacific, and even throughout the rest of Micronesia, really. And so, Guåhan currently has about 170,000, give or take. We have a current DoD population of over 14,000, but it's going to go up. It goes up all the time, probably 40,000 overall. And currently, the Department of Defense occupies 29% of the entire island. And so for a very small place, that's a lot. And the government of Guam owns even less than that, 19%. And so that's just to give you a sense of some of the just where we are in the geography that Ken was talking about earlier. All right, and so let's see, Jules is with me right now so hey Jules, so I can't wait to hear from you. But okay, so sorry, it's just showing me that you're presenting with me right now. So anyway, so sorry about that. In recent months, Guam has been and continues to be the stomping ground for several U.S. military exercises, and Ken mentioned some of these. So we had the Talisman Sabre, Pacific Iron, and Pacific Forager just recently. And so this meant 6,000 U.S. military personnel were here. We had B-52 bombers, an undisclosed amount of B-52 bombers, strikers, all kinds of vehicles and weapons, Raptors, missile defense units here for these exercises that were multi-domain operations throughout Oceania. And so in early September, the territorial epidemiologist testified before the Guam legislature that this current wave of COVID-19 cases here in Guåhan is directly related to that military activity, that we started to see first the rise in military cases before we saw the rise in the local population. And this happened also just last year in March, when we were burdened with about well over 1,000 positive sailors from the USS Theodore Roosevelt who were housed in local hotels. And also several military members broke movement restrictions, visiting several local businesses, causing a spread in the community, and of course, again, harming economic recovery. And so these are second and third waves are directly related to military activity. And there's been a lack of transparency with the military cases. We used to get the military cases reported every single day. Now, those are kind of kept under wraps. And so there's a lot at stake here. I'm going to go ahead and show you a few pictures. Let's see. So right now, with COVID, everything happening in COVID, unfortunately, it hasn't slowed military activities and construction/destruction. And so I'm just going to share a picture. In February, we hosted a protest. This is in front of the government office, or the government main headquarters. We hosted this in February. And then in April, we hosted a ceremony for several ancestors who were desecrated at a construction site. There were 4 burial sites, including 12 ancestors that were desecrated. And just recently in August, so this was a ceremony we hosted in April, and just recently in August, more remains of our ancestors were found, both in where the Marine Base Cantonment is being built. Unfortunately, it's named the Blas Marine Base after a former congressman of Guam. This is part of the erasure. The naming of these sites takes away from the original place names of these villages, and also assigning CHamoru names to this base is so problematic. I don't think a lot of family members of the Blas family support that. So I wanted to go ahead and show some pictures. So this is where the desecration of those burials took place. This is a Google Earth image at the cantonment, which is actually took place at the village of Magua. And this is a tremendous amount of land, actually, equivalent to about, Maria, my friend, really loves to remind me, equivalent to about 925 football fields of land cleared, if that gives you a visual. Also wanted to share, since Ken was talking also about the base, here's another Google Earth image of the base at Northern Guam. It takes up, that's practically the whole part of the Northern Island. And you can see that's where the clearing is there. These are the 4 ranges that are being built. And as Ken mentioned, a second contract has been awarded for the live fire training range complex to Black construction. Letexin is over here. I actually have ties to a village called Inapsan, which is on the other side, which will be impacted. So I have ancestral ties to these lands as well. And then I also want to share another picture of, here we go. This is a closer view of the ranges over Letexin, including a grenade range. While these ranges are in operation for over 2/3 of the year, we will not be able to access these sacred lands at Letexin. And that's what's so heartbreaking about that, is Letexin is one of the few places that is accessible for CHamoru's to go and collect traditional medicines, to fish, and for the original landowners to go and connect. They even have some family members buried there. And so right now the U.S. Fish and Wildlife occupies that land as a refuge, wildlife refuge, and they don't have, the public access is already limited. So it'll be closed 2/3 of the year, just for the operation of this firing range. And that doesn't include, when other groups, such as other forces from Asia and the Pacific, come here to train, including our own Guam National Guard. So just to give you some numbers, we're talking about the clearing of about 1,219 acres of limestone forest for the construction of the ranges and the base. The ranges themselves will see close to 7 million ammunitions a year fired right over what is our main source for fresh drinking water, our Northern Lens Aquifer. On top of that, the base is installing new wells, which will withdraw 1.2 million gallons of water a day. So not only is risk for contamination greater, the withdrawal the demand on the aquifer is going to be incredible. We have 10 newly listed endangered and threatened species, including traditional medicines that will be impacted. 269 historic properties will be harmed, 63 of which are eligible for the National Registry of Historic Places. And this all with this long history of contamination that's taking place here. We have 19 Superfund sites, 80 contaminated military sites that have never been cleaned up. And as well as, the fact that Guam is a downwinder for nuclear radiation from the horrible crimes against the Marshallese people that took place with the nuclear testing. And so with that, we continue to get reports that remains of our ancestors are found. More remains were just found at this place called Andy South, where the urban combat training area is being built. And so the work of Pertei, Latex, and Sabertidian is, and the other groups that I'm a part of, really fight against the destruction and desecration of culturally significant sites, but also, wanting to really bring about awareness and to help inform our community that these are clear injustices of U.S. imperialism, environmental racism, and the violation of our inherent rights as Indigenous people, which is to protect and defend all that we hold sacred, including our land, air, and waters. And I think those are the main points I wanted to make. I think with that, I'd like to close with, if I can, let's see. I wanted to close with a picture of, I wanted to close with a few pictures of some of the family members of Pertei Latex, of Latexan rather. And so I wanted to share some pictures because, we really need to be aware that this is native land that was stolen and occupied, as is all of the military occupation in Guam. Unlike that video that says, the MRC is that all this training and activities taking place on lands that are owned and by the military. That's a lie. These are stolen and occupied lands, and we need to call them what they are. And so I really want to end with sharing some images of the families whose land was stolen at Latexan. This is my friend Maria Hernandez and her cousin Chrissy, and Maria's mom is Lou Bejado, who is an amazing activist for Latexan. Maria now has 2 babies, and so we're looking at about 5 generations fighting for the return of that land. And this is Chrissy's mom. And then I also wanted to share this slide. So this is Auntie Kat here, who I mentioned earlier. And she says, that her grandparents didn't want to give up Ritidian, and it breaks their heart that this fight continues. And so at one point, Ritidian was actually considered excess land. Sorry, I'm in an office that has power saving things, so it's a little dark right now, but I promise I'm not trying to be romantic or anything. I'll turn the light on in just a second. But there are all these laws to prevent, the taking, the federalization of this property, because it was deemed excess. And so it should have been returned to the families. So after World War II, the land was condemned via eminent domain, and families were forced to relocate despite objections. And Auntie Kat's family was actually sued by the federal government for not taking the money that they were offered for that taking by eminent domain. And so after decades, it was considered excess, and it should have been returned to the families, but instead the Navy got it so that it could go to U.S. Fish and Wildlife and continue to be federally occupied. And so I think that's everything I wanted to share today. Just thank you so much for your time. Again, it's an honor to be here with all of you, and Sinamasi. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nick, for sharing those images and your story. The 5 generations of resistance is heartbreaking and inspiring. And thank you for sharing about Auntie Kat and that acknowledgement, which I'm sure is not easy to share in front of an audience. So I also put some info in the chat if folks can see about some of the climate impacts, especially regarding whales and drinking water and forests. And I want to introduce, last but not least, we were promised a fun ending presentation from Julian. So the fun part of this webinar is that you all get to take action about something that you may not have been this aware about before, ideally, because we know that so many folks in the US are not aware that their tax dollars are going to this oppression, active harming, ongoing occupation, and militarization. And so I'm going to introduce Julian, and I'm going to put, when Julian's speaking, I'll put an article that Julian wrote about Guåhan. Julian is an Indigenous writer and human rights lawyer working at the intersection of international Indigenous rights and environmental law. A native son of Guam, Julian founded his own law firm to advocate for the myriad peoples of the Pacific region. Julian lectures at the University of Guam and the William S. Richardson School of Law, where he teaches international law and Pacific Island legal systems. He has published numerous books and law articles on a range of international law and human rights issues. He lives in Yona, Guam. Thank you, Julian, for being here today.
Thank you so much, Madison. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you. And I guess I'll just start by saying, whoever said I was going to be the life of the party lied to you, because I don't know exactly what I'm supposed to do other than try to kind of say a few things that perhaps weren't said. I think all the speakers said a ton of things. And in some ways, you know, when we talk about Guam, right, because it's so far removed, it's so much on the colonial periphery, right? It's so far out of that it's just always this peripheral issue, even when we're confronting empire, even when Chalmers Johnson is writing a book about empire, even when Catherine Lutz is writing a book about there is this sort of sense that we have, at least the indigenous people, you know, who call Guam our home, you know, that we are always never manage to figure in any sort of central way in the discourse, even when that discourse totally involves like our daily life. And even because our daily life, like, I mean, I feel like my full-time job is confronting empire. Like I literally like 5 days a week. This is what we do. I'll just let you know that I'm a lawyer for Protehi Latexan for NAIC's organization, NAIC who just spoke. And we filed, it's just, we're lurching from one lawsuit to another. Like, you know, we're working with Center for Biological Diversity, Earth Justice. I'm just like all of us, and we're just we kind of are in this sort of like, I guess you could call it the great game together. You know, we're locked in this terrible waste of time. I mean, we all are trying to do our best, right? We're trying to like fight within this system in terms of like the lawsuits that we're all filing left and right, and mostly losing, by the way. And we win some for sure, but I think that's part of what we have to do. We have to really sort of pick this apart to understand that so much of the sort of like arsenal on offer, you know, so many of the federal environmental statutes, for example, that so many of us are litigating under to try to stop the firing range, protect the 8-spotted butterfly, challenge the, like as Isa said, our earlier speaker, challenge the segmentation of the various environmental impact assessments, you know, because the US should have done them all together. All of these cases, right? Most of them we've lost. I mean, so like, I think in part because of like very convenient sort of like, doctrines that serve imperialism, like the political question doctrine, which is just it's just basically a way for federal courts to evade any responsibility for, you know, like helping solve any of these problems, you know, and they say this is an issue better left to the political branches of government. So we are going to exercise judicial restraint and stay out of this. We've seen a lot of political question doctrine sort of evasions. We've also seen like even new ones, like where Isa's from in CNMI, and she Representative Babout is here as well. In the CNMI, a group of awesome organizations, community-based organizations, working with Earth Justice. We filed a lawsuit there challenging the marine location from Okinawa to Guam and the CNMI. And we lost that case on some very, very technical ground about redressability. It's like a prong of the standing test. I'm not trying to take you out of law school. I'm trying to like point out how fucking clear it is to me that we have like all in some ways wasted a significant amount of time believing that the law is capable of providing the redress that we're interested in. And I'm saying this as a lawyer who litigates a lot. Like I'm now, all I know is like, all I keep thinking about, you guys, is something that Alice Walker wrote when she said, the way forward is with a broken heart. I feel like ridiculously brokenhearted. And I'm just like sort of plowing through it, you know? But the only thing that's sort of keeping my shit together is being in community with people on the ground in civil society groups. I mean, watching groups like CODEPINK do their thing. I am so supportive of the Pentagon budget, like all of this. And what we're seeing now, like we have to be, I don't have a very, like a more robust conversations about the limitations of the law and legal process and because our political energy, like our time, I mean, these are finite resources. We are all lurching from one crisis to another. We can barely, I mean, I have lawyer friends, activist friends across the country, and we're all kind of locked in this thing, right? And we're all in this sort of thing together. And we're running out of time. And climate change has put us on an unforgiving timeline. You know, it is just all become very clear to me, so much so that like, I probably will take a break from law or leave it altogether in a year. I mean, I've done almost everything that I wanted to do with it. The last thing was filing this submission on behalf of Flotilla Texan to the to the Human Rights Council. We're trying to now invoke international, I guess the UN's body of independent human rights experts to try to pronounce on the illegality of the military buildup. We succeeded recently, and we actually got a historic joint allegation letter from not only one, but three special rapporteurs who are actually like calling the US military, you know, to account. I mean, it's kind of unheard of, because the CHamoru people, my people, our people, we have been going to the UN for 40 years with no progress. We've just sort of used all the available. So I guess what I'm saying is like, when you look back and you stop and you pause for a second and we're honest, we have just wasted an incredible amount of our time, you know, and our political energy, which is finite, which we don't have endless supplies of, you know, barking up certain trees and trying to do this. And I think what we really need to be doing at this point is not only interrogating language on the one hand, and I have some specific points I want to talk about with regard to that video that began this program. And also, on the other hand, just trying really, really hard to rekindle our radical imagination with each other and finding ways to do it. You know, because like, so let me stop there and now talk about some of that language, tracking the language, right? Like that propaganda thing that started this webinar, right? The ESA, like they were just listing all the buzzwords, right? Endangered Species Act, the protection of the coral reef, the US being on the Reef Task Force, the protection of cultural historic resources, and the US military striving to minimize the adverse impacts on the environment. So I'm going to take them one by one. We just sued the US Fish and Wildlife because they advocated, you know, like what's happening essentially is that the Fish and Wildlife, like NOAA, I mean, both when it comes to the terrestrial and the marine environments, the agencies entrusted by the federal government to protect these species, for example, on land and at sea, have abdicated their role. Essentially, what we're having is these agencies that are supposed to protect these species are not protecting anything. They have essentially given waivers to the US military. So this is effectively what's happening. Is like they can talk a good game about environmental protection, but they almost never protect the environment because they keep waiving all of the requirements. So what you have actually in these documents, you have what's called incidental take statements. If you've read all of these, after all of the, and then it just lists all the species that the federal agency is totally aware that the US military is going to destroy, just kill. Like we shouldn't call them incidental take statements. We should call them death lists. That's what they are. You know, like this, like we have to track like all of this. And so the ESA, right? Like the Marianas fruit bat, the Marianas 8-spot butterfly, the Pacific slender-toed gecko. These are just some of the Endangered Species Act, some of which actually have critical habitat designations already. The US military, I mean, basically Fish and Wildlife is just giving them a take statement. They're giving the military pass left and right. So that's why the projects are allowed to proceed. With regard to the coral reef, the US military, when this project was first announced, wasn't actually interested in say they've scaled back some of the plans, but one of the plans was the birthing of a nuclear aircraft carrier. And that would have entailed the destruction of 40 football fields worth of thriving coral reef. So, but so this is what we need to do. We need to track their use of language, refute every single point, because clearly that's doing, and I don't mean in a court of law, but on the streets, when we're basically lobbying, when US taxpayers are lobbying their representatives. I mean, it is absurd that Pentagon, the budget, what was it, 715 million? What I think
$780 billion, the highest,
700,
record highest Pentagon budget in the history of US military.
Yes, and that is such a good point, Madison. But what's another point related to that? It actually grew in the House, right? House added on another $25 billion. So bringing it to 740 and then higher, right? So what we're doing is another thing we need to, wow, I thought I was going to talk long, but clearly I'm now sort of on a roll. So if I could just have 2.5 more minutes. We should track that as well. Is that okay, Madison? Okay, 1.5. I'll really go fast.
No, you're fine.
Okay. So another thing is we need to start return to some of the original language. Now we're so used to calling it the military industrial complex, but its original name was the military industrial congressional complex. I mean, if Congress is going to be a bedfellow, call it what it is. Congress is just throwing, and that is not even to mention, the House's inability and the progressives' inability to really stop funding Israel, even the Iron Dome, all of it. This is all, I'm just kind of, wow, I'm kind of going to church right now. I'm going to dial it back. Because I'm just, as a writer, it matters to me. I use words, I use precisely the words. I'm very deliberate about them. And I feel but non-writers too, we all have to be exceedingly specific. Precision matters when we're confronting empire in a really, really significant way. And I think in a way that's under-examined. I do believe that. And so that is one of sort of the things that I'm trying to sort of encourage to. And the other one, I guess, is we need to tell better stories. I believe this is true in the climate context as much as the demil context. And that is in some ways, you guys, when the IPCC report came out, right? We all, freshly sobered by all of those facts, ocean acidification, massive coral die-off, sea level rise, all the timelines are bumped up. It's all of that doom, right? And on the same other hand, this presentation and this webinar, the facts of empire, it's a spreading canopy and it has no intent to stop. We know that the US is goading us into another war, with China, and we know all of it is happening. That's why we strategically forget to mention other facts, right? So paying attention to what facts, what's excluded as much as what's included in the conversation. No one, obviously the State Department is very quick to condemn China and come out with all of these statements, but there's no mention of the fact that China basically has lifted over 700 million people out of absolute poverty. There's no mention of all the ways China contained COVID. There's so many other things that need to be sort of talked about. So we need to track and stop empire as soon as it uses the language of othering. There's a violent othering going on, and it starts with our language. It starts with the words that we choose to use or don't use, and being really hyper vigilant about empire's use of language is super important. I guess the last thing I'll say is just taking all of this, this is sort of why when I say we need to tell better stories, I believe, for me, this happened last year. I experienced this. The US military personnel were running around rampant, violating all of the executive orders, as Nate said, spreading contamination and disease in the community. And it was so much to handle. And at the same time, our youth, suicide rate, including youth suicide, was going up. It was 1 every 6 days. So it was just so much death, and it was so accelerated. It was so fast, and I couldn't breathe, and I realized part of what's happening, is that we have lost our ability to speak to each other. And part of that is we're all sort of collectively being buried by an avalanche of facts. And it is up to each of us to claw our way out. And stories might be the way to do that. Stories, if we connect on a human level, person to person, we can resist sort of the othering process, because, we can connect to each other's stories in a way. So that's why I started writing really deeply personal stories about losing my father, for example, in the book that I just wrote. But the reason why I'm saying all of this is because we have to deploy that feminist insight, that really useful feminist insight, that the personal is political. And if we can find ever new ways to do that, if we can find ways to do that, with just bring all of our innovation and all of our sort of political imagination to the task of making the personal political, we can make a whole lot more fucking progress. Okay, that's it. I think that was, those are all the major things I wanted to. Thank you so much. Sorry for going over.
Thank you so much. I can ask everyone to unmute for a second and we can give a little round of applause. Thank you for taking us to church.
Viva!
Yay. Woo, viva CHamoru!
Very good.
Thank you, Julian, for so much of giving us insight into your legal world and the frustrations around using the system to achieve any kind of safety or liberation, and for the calls to action to start fostering more of a radical imagination in anti-war peace work and in racial justice work, economic justice work, more ways to communicate, and to remember that the personal is political. Thank you so much. We really appreciate having you, as well as all the other guests, Nick, Dr. Ariola, Dr. Kuper. I'm just gonna ask a couple questions and then we're gonna finish up. So we did plan for this webinar to be a little longer than an hour. Well, we might go a little bit over an hour and a half, but I'll try to close up soon. So these questions will be at all of you all. So if you both want to answer something, feel free to just let me know and chime in, or if just one of you wants to take some on. And if there are questions in the chat, we can try to get to them if there is time. Thanks everyone for sticking around. We really appreciate it. One moment. So my first question is in response to some of the things we've seen and heard tonight. What does the way the military defines their stance, quote, forward deployment, quote, troop readiness in the Pacific, what does that actually mean? And when the US government and military speaks of, quote, deterrence or, quote, defense, it's, grandfathered into the Department of, quote, Defense with regards to stated enemies like China, or today we mentioned North Korea, the DPRK. How is this misleading about the power dynamic between the US empire and its stated enemies?
I can try to get that. So, when we hear forward defense, deterrence, denial, all these sort of words, right? I mean, the basic military strategic logic is that forward basing actually provides a further deterrent effect, right? And that was deterrence, we all mean it's different from compellence. Sorry, I'm an IR nerd, so apologies. Okay, but deterrence, preventing another state from taking an action via changing the cost of calculation for them, right? So they believe, the U.S. military believe, via, in a lot of ways we see this with the island chain strategy today, that having these distant bases helps extend the deterrent effect away from the homeland and prevent attacks from the homeland. And so that's what I was trying to say, that I think when we think about all these things, what is Guam situated as, right? Is Guam, if security, for example, is a territory to be protected against a threat, is Guam actually a national territory to be protected, or is it a tool to be used? And I think those are some uncomfortable political questions that we need to ask ourselves in Guam, because the very popular political rhetoric is that the bases protect Guam, right? So we need to reorient. And furthermore, I think we can see this whole deterrence rhetoric, which has its roots in strategy and military logic. I just want to read something regarding that in Guam. Okay, missile defense in Guam can convince an adversary that its attack will fail, or that the cost of overcoming missile defense systems would outweigh the benefits of success, right? And surprisingly, what we are starting to see, like in a piece illustrated or authored in Foreign Policy, the periodical, was a piece to make Guam a state, right? And the whole logic for making Guam a state is that Guam would be under the permanent sovereignty of the US, and it would signal to China that an attack on Guam is completely unacceptable and would provoke major consequences, right? So we see Guam being used in this tool for deterrence by denial, right? Showing hostile forces that they will not win, right? And the 360 missile defense system is a part of that. Now, what we also see in the rhetoric is, we had, for example, I forgot to mention in my presentation, the British aircraft carrier that visited Guam recently, right? And a bunch of countries making Indo-Pacific strategies, right? This new Indo-Pacific, which is a new geographical imagination, is that we are seeing the lines being drawn with upholding what they're calling the free and open Indo-Pacific, right? So there we're starting to see this be used as a justification for further power projection and expansion, yeah? Now, the other question about misleading, right? And this is something that I wanted to talk about a little bit, right? Is, there's this whole branch in the national security world. There's a debate, and I actually agree with a lot of them. There's like the Quincy Institute, for example, that believes in a foreign policy of restraint. Now, but the restraint folks, a lot of times, and this is a piece I wrote for Responsible Statecraft, they actually say that even if we were to reduce, the US was to reduce its basing footprint and for defense deployments, Guam and Diego Garcia are two bases that should remain operational because they serve as a convenient location that are low cost and fully capable, that avoid what they call strategic baggage of foreign territory, right? So that's where I'm trying, in my work in IR national security, is even in these arguments with progressives where they're trying to reduce the basing footprint, where does that situate Guam? And then secondly, to the misleading, let's say that tomorrow we woke up and it was not misleading, right? Let's say that the US national security strategy was exactly right on China is a threat, right? Absolute threat to its hegemony. Let's say they woke up and it was not misleading. Do the results change, right? Is Guam, do we then accept that Guam will be used as someone right there, human shield, right? So are we only opposing Guam's militarization because the rhetoric of intensification of geopolitics is misleading or not? I mean, that's just something to think about. If we woke up tomorrow and it was like China is an imminent threat, will progressives then wake up and say, well, I don't know, maybe we should use Guam as the sacrificial shield, right? So that's a conversation, an uncomfortable conversation that I think we need to ask ourselves. And lastly, and I think we in Guam need to remind the world that geopolitics is built on the backs of people like us, right? And that whether something is discursive or material or whatever, the fact is that preparation for war is dangerous for us in Guam in a way that may be materially different from others, right? Because we see that building up internal balancing capabilities in the region for the US, right? Trying to show that we can the US can counter attacks from China or North Korea in Guam requires preparations that affect our homelands, and as Nick said, right? And so these are sort of the uncomfortable conversations, is that even if it's a misleading rhetoric, if it was exactly correct, does that then justify Guam's usage in that potential way? And so I'll end there, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you for going into that in much more depth and kind of following from what Julian said, making sure we are being specific and not generalizing or using narratives that don't serve everyone. But I think that does highlight how, regardless of what the operating threat that the Pentagon and Congress are using to drum up more funds for our military, there's always going to be another one, and there's always plans for another perceived threat. The Pentagon calls this threat inflation theory, and Guam will be in the crosshairs of that threat. And I know like China and the DPRK were planned to be the next eminent threats like as early as the fall of the Soviet Union, because the Pentagon needs a new threat inflation idea for the people to be manufactured into consent for war, essentially. So I'm going to ask just a couple more, just kind of about organizing and what folks here, especially US citizens, can do. So one question is, how has coalition building been going in opposition to this militarization? I know Nick spoke a little bit about this, but what other communities have you worked with and across the world, internationally, and is it difficult to organize across the islands? What strategies help with all of that? We're in the place with COVID where there's a lot of digital organizing happening. So has that always been the case for you, et cetera? I think, are you able to unmute? I might have changed the settings. Sorry about that, folks.
Okay.
There we go. Thanks.
Madison. Yeah. Actually, if I could just also add to Ken's answer of that question, the previous question before we talk about a coalition building. In terms of the forward deployment and troop readiness in the Pacific, what it actually means. And since 2016, we've been hearing this rhetoric that China has a bomb called the Guam killer and has put it in parades and, and has taken it down the street for to get all kinds of people, riled up. And it's actually part of the rhetoric the Pentagon's using now for, for this massive demand for funds for the Pacific Deterrence Act. So it's that is part of that rhetoric that they're using. And even just last year, let's see, we had the Anderson Air Force Base had something called an elephant walk, where all of the jets and planes did their own sort of parade and procession. And it was really to demonstrate to China probably that, they can generate combat air power at a moment's notice. And then, also in July, we started hearing about, there were these news stories, national news stories about the THAAD missile defense here and Patriot missiles. But these are solely, meant to defend the military's resources on the base, not the people of Guam. And so that's part of the misleading rhetoric too, that, that misinforms our community, that the THAAD is here to protect the people of Guam, the island's resources. No, all of that posturing really is part of the problem. So I just wanted to add that none of those are for protect real genuine security. They're all really, yeah, they're not. And so, and in terms of a coalition building, let's see. Well, Flotilla, Texan, Ihaken Famalawan, Guåhan, Independent Guåhan, we're all part of the Whanokī Coalition here. And the Whanokī Coalition is really working, focusing on Chamorro self-determination. All of us, all of our groups have been really doing a lot of this kind of work, digital work, trying to think of more digital campaigns, because it's also, we're dealing with digital burnout to a certain degree as well, right? But it's always great to see community here as well. And I see a lot of folks here we've presented with just recently for, an opposition, the Talisman Saber, or friends in Okinawa, Japan, and in Hawaii as well. So we're constantly trying to build connections, figure out ways we can work with each other. Joy is here. I hope to do some cool projects with Joy in the future, focusing on art. And then of course we want to work with ISA too, to see how PLSR and our Commonwealth 670 can collaborate. And we just really want to thank CODEPINK too, because this is historic, an all Chamorro, Marianas focused panel. This is great because it really is bringing our struggle to a much larger audience and helping us gain more support too for our work. So thank you so much, Sizos Masi.
Thanks. And just on that note, you can follow our campaign in the chat, codepink.org/China, twitter.com/China not enemy. But thank you for adding that. And I put in also the link to the urgent Chamorro self-determination appeal petition. And And I'm just gonna ask one more question I kind of alluded to, and if any of y'all can't unmute because I think I changed the setting accidentally, just direct message me and I can unmute you if you want to speak. Definitely want to give you all a chance to speak if you'd like. So I just wanted to ask, for folks here, I can expand it internationally. I think, you know, we have a lot of international supporters for our campaign, in our coalition, et cetera, but how can US citizens here in the US mainland, that's where I am, Turtle Island, help resist the US war buildup and increase militarization of Guam and the Marianas? And if you want to extend that to how the international community as well, any ways that we can take action? I know we have a bunch of petitions here. Anything else that you have to say on that?
I guess I'll just go. Only because one of the things I've been thinking about recently was we should have a freedom flotilla. Like it should just be in the style of the ones that have already happened. I mean, I just reached out to Anne Wright recently about this idea, because I think this is exactly what, you know, what's happening. All the war games are being played off, you know, off the coast of Guam, and DoD is currently militarizing a section of the ocean here, roughly the size of India. And so this is just a massive thing that has just global significance, and we should have just a bang up, you know, like a global civil society sort of event. You know, we should invite other groups too who have historically done really important work in this region, like Greenpeace, who, you know, is the one who helped the Rongelapese people in the Marshall Islands leave Rongelap that was still irradiated on the Rainbow Warrior. You know, that those kinds of campaigns, and be a little creative with them to do more direct action, but also just like all the basic things like signing the petitions, but really realizing that, you know, like just as taxpayers, you know, and being in proximity to the metropole, like you know, US actors in particular can do a few things like better lobby Congress. Like our congressperson doesn't have a vote, and even if he did, he would vote pro-military anyway. So like using your contacts is also really important. There's a ton of like specific things, and I won't go into too much detail, but like maybe, and also reaching out to civil society groups in Guam and better connecting, because we have tons of ideas. Some of them are legislative and policy in nature, and some are direct action in nature. So there's like a wide range. But also just, sorry to go back to the very first question. I just think, again, if we're tracking the language, you know, like what your first question was about forward deployment, you know, like from China's perspective, you know, it looks very different. It's like, as far as China's concerned, it's not also sending its warships on, you know, on the west coast of California, but they believe that the US warships are right off the, you know, here. So they believe that that is aggression. So it's just, you know, and also like tracking which countries are actually speaking in terms of multipolarity and which ones are not. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that we need to do, but, and also just, last thing I'll say, generally, just don't be, be a really good citizen. Don't be goaded into this war with China. Like, we have to just put all of our eggs in this basket. I know it's crazy, but with the whole, right when Afghanistan, like right when that happened, we already knew that China was next. We were like, it's a longer game. And like the US has actually been very clear about announcing this. Hillary Clinton in 2011 went to East West Center in Hawaii and called this America's Pacific Century. And if you track all of the things, all of the quadrennial defense review reports, all of the speeches, we have been headed to this road for quite some time, where we're just sleeping in some ways, like some of us, you know, and not CODEPINK, obviously, but other groups who are like based in the US, continental US, have been sleeping on this issue for far too long. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, Julian, you reminded me, Kamala Harris just recently went to Singapore and did something really similar after the withdrawal. Like the Pacific is, I'm forgetting the language now, but it's like the Pacific is the center again, you know, of this war, right? Like we all have to kind of shift our attention away now to the Asia Pacific realm, right? And so it's just like this constant recycling. And so yeah, I mean there's so much to say here, but you quickly find that when you do demilitarization work, you have to reach out, right? It's so global in scope. You immediately are connected to so many people so quickly, right? But one of the things that I've noticed with this work too, and I think it's really important, is like it's just the work in our own communities, right? Like it's kind of amazing to be on panels like this and to hear people that kind of understand, where we're coming from. But even in our home communities, I think it's a lot of work. Like, for example, OCW, our group has like an anonymous membership where you can join because people are still like worried about speaking out about a lot of these issues, right? Because we're so interconnected to the military. So there's also kind of that portion, I think, of the activism and the work that takes a toll as well, but it's all very much interconnected. And so, yeah, I just wanted to mention that. And again, just a big thank you to CODEPINK for making this possible and making these conversations possible.
Thank you all so much. I think we're going to end there because we are a little bit over an hour and a half, which was the intended length. And thank you to all of our supporters who are here today, as well as loyal supporters who are here at all of our webinars. We do have some upcoming ones next week. Next Wednesday, we have on October 6th, in the morning Pacific time, I'm participating in No Cold War Britain's Stop Asian Hate UK rally, featuring some recent victims of anti-Asian violence in the UK. And we also have part 3 of our series on the US and China with Coalition Peace Initiative. And this week 3 is going to be on McCarthyism in the 50s, Vincent Chin, Wenho Lee, and more. So you can check those out in the chat or on our events, our action calendar at codepink.org. And yeah, I want to honor that it was mentioned that this is historic to have an all CHamoru panel, which I'm very much appreciative of. I'm so happy that you can all speak. And I hope that the magnitude and the stakes of the impact on CHamoru communities was made clear today, because I know that it's not made clear in the mainstream media in the US and generally in the West and beyond. So I'm really just hoping that we were able to honor that and to understand the impact that our tax dollars and our military budget has on Indigenous peoples and our environment and our planet. Hope you all have a wonderful morning, evening, wherever you are in the world. And this will be on YouTube later. Thank you so much.